Our guest on This is America in the World is David Ignatius. He's a foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Post, former executive editor of the International Herald Tribune, and author of 9 novels, including his new book due out in June called The Director. David, thank you for sitting with us once again.
Happy to be with you, Dennis.
What went wrong in Iraq?
Boy, that's a question that has so many different parts of the answer. I think what went wrong in Iraq, first of all, is that we invaded Iraq. I think that was an error, that it created a resistance movement that we have been dealing with ever since. It knocked down the greatest regional adversary to Iran, so in the process of invading Iraq, we made Iran much more powerful. Today, the government in Baghdad, as near as I can tell, is pretty much an instrument of Iran, is controlled on all major decisions by the Iranian government, which makes it tough for the United States. This is a place where American soldiers and Marines fought and died, yes. 4,000 dead. Some people reckon the cost as high as $1 trillion. And we have almost no leverage today. I found it heartbreaking in the last couple of weeks to see that Fallujah in western Iraq, in Anbar province, Sunni town, was again taken over by fighters from al-Qaeda after Americans by the hundreds had lost their lives to drive al-Qaeda fighters out of Fallujah in 2004, 2005.
Who's fighting who over there now in that area?
Iraq, after we knocked the pillars of the structure of the Iraqi government down, after we toppled Saddam Hussein, who enforced order there at the point of a gun, really ruled by torture, after we knocked that regime down, people in the chaos that followed retreated to their most basic identifications of sect, of tribe, of region. So Sunnis became much more Sunni Muslims. Shiite Muslims felt much more passionate about their Shia identity. Kurds stayed in Kurdistan. And so the country sort of pulled back away from modernity. We probably imagined that we were invading Iraq to make it more modern, but the sad result is that we ended up making it much less modern. So as people became more sectarian, they retreated into these identities, and in places like Fallujah, the Sunnis turned to their tribal leaders. The tribal leaders in the beginning turned toward the jihadist extremists. They were so angry at the United States for, in their view, taking power away from them, their families, from the Iraqi army. And so we got into that long fight against an Iraqi insurgency. Finally, after so much blood and money, it seemed that we had suppressed that insurgency, thanks to General Petraeus in 2007, 2008. So Fallujah really was cleared of insurgent fighters, and by the time the U.S. military left, it was a fairly stable place. I can remember going there often in that period. And so it's heartbreaking to see that because Prime Minister Maliki, the Shiite Prime Minister of Iraq, was a very sectarian, divisive figure, and basically let the Sunnis of Fallujah and Ramadi and those other cities, let them go. They fell back into this very angry sectarian identity and ended up turning to al-Qaeda in some cases. And so we, as I said at the outset, we have al-Qaeda back in these places where it was kicked out.
So Anbar's is a kind of Sunni territory, and then you get the Maliki, which is Shia government, central government. And now we got al-Qaeda resurfacing, and a kind of a training ground or to go into Syria. And we've got extremist militias that are, well, I guess one question is, which side is Maliki on? Is he on our side? Is he on Iran's side?
My own judgment is that at the end of the day, he will follow the dictates of Iran, and I think we've seen evidence of that.
Well,
Iran is his
we
neighbor.
prop him up, though, don't we?
Well, we did. We put him in power in the first place. He owes the fact that he's prime minister to the United States, to the fact that we toppled Saddam Hussein first and then helped him become prime minister twice. But Iran is much closer. We're far away. We have really walked away from Iraq, and Maliki knows it. So his government is thoroughly infiltrated with people who were very, very close to Iran. And at the end of the day, I think they're the decisive force. In some ways, that's not surprising. I mean, you know, people who live in Rhode Island pay a lot more attention to Massachusetts than they do to, you know, Ecuador.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a little bit of that going on there. Iran is close, and Iran is determined to exert influence, and it does.
So now we got Iraq, and now Syria is playing into this now, isn't it?
So what's happened tragically, but you could say predictably, is that through the whole of the Euphrates Valley, the Euphrates River runs through Syria into Iraq. Fallujah and Ramadi are part of that Euphrates Valley. And that whole area, among the Sunni tribes that live there, the jihadist extremists have become very powerful. They rose up against the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is from the Alawite sect, which is a kind of Shia sect, and that sectarian feeling was part of the revolt against Assad. So these Sunni fighters fighting in Syria began increasingly to ally with the Sunnis across the border in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Al-Qaeda in Syria fused. They literally took the same name. They now call themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, sometimes called the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. But the border between Iraq and Syria has, practically speaking, dissolved as these fighters move back and forth. And the terrible nightmare for the United States and for all of the neighboring countries, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, is how are these Al-Qaeda fighters who've taken deep root in this Euphrates Valley across Syria and Iraq, how are they going to be driven out? What force is going to be organized to take away their independent power there? And it's something I think our government here in Washington is just beginning to get its mind around.
But we're powerless, aren't we?
Well,
in a way?
You know, it's hard to say a superpower is ever powerless. Certainly the American people wouldn't tolerate
But as Kerry said, no more boots on the ground.
No, people wouldn't tolerate sending troops back into Iraq or sending them into Syria either. So that's not going to happen. But there are a lot of things short of that the United States could do, and I think should do. For example, I traveled inside Syria in October of 2012 with the Sunni fighters, went to Aleppo with them, and I came away thinking these people really need the kind of training that the United States is very good at providing. They're fighting against Bashar al-Assad, a dictator who's using chemical weapons against his own people, a really very murderous regime. So the idea of training them to fight against that regime, fight for a better Syria, I think makes sense. That wouldn't put U.S. boots on the ground, but it would give them real help. The U.S. is now, in the last couple of months, helping Prime Minister Maliki in Iraq by providing him with some weapons, some technology. I like to joke, Maliki is the only leader in the world who's asking for more NSA surveillance in his country. He wants everything the NSA could tell him about where these Al-Qaeda fighters are. So there are ways in which the U.S. can provide assistance, help reasonable people fight against extremism without putting U.S. boots on the ground and getting into the kind of mess that we know all too well.
We're going to take a little break. Talking with David Ignatius, Washington Post foreign affairs columnist, author of a number of books, 9 books, I think, novels. He writes brilliantly about the Middle East and the Arab world. Take a little break. Back on the other side, more with David Ignatius. This is America and the World. This is America is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and the F.Y. Chang Foundation. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services. 3 states solution for Iraq, possible? Sunni area, Shia, Kurdistan?
Well, you know, we call it federalism, and
a federation.
I think a federation of these 3 regions that each have different characters, different ethnic makeup makes a lot of sense. The idea of splitting the country into 3 pieces raises as many questions as it solves. So I've never been too excited about that. And in any event, this is not a decision for the United States to make. I mean, if the Iraqi people decide they want to dissolve their boundaries and have 3 states, that's their decision. Sometimes you think it's going that way, but I'm struck when I travel in that part of the world that, you know, strangely enough, the Iraqi identity is still pretty strong in Lebanon. I mean, the Lebanese fought a civil war for 15 years. They killed 100,000 people, but the idea of being Lebanese still means something to people, even if you're a Christian or whatever. So
I want to get to Iran in a minute, but I do want to close the loop on Syria. 2 million refugees, 100,000 more dead. The world was against Assad, most of the world, yet he survived. How so?
Well, I think Assad survived in part by using brutally tough weapons. He bombed his own cities. From all the evidence that I've seen, he used chemical weapons against his people. So he did what it took to stay in power. It should also be said that the rebels fighting him increasingly began to use barbarous tactics themselves and turned the people against them. In the areas that I traveled, in the areas around Aleppo, often these Sunni rebel fighters have behaved like warlords. They capture territory and then they begin to quite brutally command the areas themselves. So it's a tough part of the world. It's one reason I'd like to see the U.S. get involved in training the rebels, so that they have a little bit more of the command and control and structure that would make the fabric of a future country with some people who could lead it.
But are we now back to who do you trust? The rebels were supposed to be fighting Assad, and now we got Al-Qaeda fighting the rebels. And the rebels, as you say, some of them Sunni fighters are behaving atrociously. Who do we know to train? I mean,
well, that's been one of the questions: is how do you vet people as they come in for training, and how do you decide who you should bring on and who not? And you know, they're difficult problems, but they're not insoluble. I mean, that's what you have an intelligence service for, is to figure out questions like that. I don't think these are difficult, but not impossible questions. I think the alternative of just letting the whole thing adrift is a mistake. I think it's for the U.S. to work with its close allies, countries we work with for years. Jordan, obviously one. The United Arab Emirates, obviously one. Turkey, obviously one. Britain, obviously one. France, obviously one. All those countries would join if the U.S. would provide some leadership in establishing some kind of structure that would give the Syrian rebels the basics of training, and I think that's the right way to go.
More talks happening there to see if somebody can arrive at a political solution? At
the end of the day, in Syria, as in Lebanon, as in Afghanistan, as in all of these war-torn places, the solution will be political. It won't be military. Right now, it's hard to see the basis for negotiation, and that's one reason that I think it makes sense to work with the rebels so they have a little more staying power. But there are talks in Geneva coming up. The key here is making a political transition to get to some more stable basis for future Syria. People who argue, as the Russians sometimes do, oh, well, let's just let Bashar al-Assad continue as president. I just don't think it's possible for him, after having killed so many of his own people, to govern effectively. It strikes me as a fantasy.
Russia wants Iran at the table to talk, and we can't get the rebels to get to the table.
Well, so far we're having trouble getting the rebels to the table. I honestly don't think the time is ripe now for a full political solution to the war. I wish it was. Right now, I think it would be enough to get confidence-building measures through the provision of humanitarian assistance, to get aid through into the areas where people are starving this winter. This is a nightmarish winter in Syria. So if you could start with that and get enough agreement to allow supplies to move and people to have temporary ceasefires and begin to gain a little confidence, I think that would make sense. I think there are areas where the rebels would be willing to work with the Syrian army to provide for humanitarian assistance to benefit everybody's relatives, because everybody's caught up in that. So that's the kind of thing that I think we should begin with. You know, down the road,
little steps.
Yeah, little, because I think right now the giant step, if it were possible, great, but I don't think it is possible.
You've returned from Iran, had a major interview with the foreign minister, Mohammad Zarif, is it pronounced?
Yes.
Yep. Tell us a little bit about the background. How do you get an interview with the foreign minister of Iran? And tell us some of the high points.
The way you get the interview is by making a nuisance of yourself and,
you ask, right.
and asking over and over again. In this case, I first met Ambassador Zarif when he was Iran's ambassador to the United Nations in New York, and I would go up and see him, meet with him. I'm a journalist. I can meet with whoever I want. I think that's part of my job. So I go back with him some years. When he became foreign minister under this new government of President Rouhani, I met him in New York in September. I was given the only on-the-record print interview with President Rouhani. Very interesting conversation then, in which he told me, I'd like to see a deal on the nuclear issue within 3 months. And I thought, you're kidding me.
Wow.
Well, it turned out he beat his timetable. He got it even sooner than that. But at that time, I talked to Zarif about visiting with him. And then he invited me to come see him in December. I have to say, even after that invitation from the foreign ministry, you'd think you just walk in. No, I'm sorry, not that easy. There were obviously some people who didn't want me to come, so my visa was delayed and back and forth, and it wasn't the easiest passage through passport control when I got to the airport in Tehran. But once there, it was a wonderful interview in the sense that Zarif, who speaks perfect English, and is an example of what's really very modern about Iran, answered each of the very specific questions that I had about what the elements of a nuclear deal, a comprehensive nuclear deal, would be. And so I went through the list. What about your heavy water reactor at Arak? Are you prepared to close that? That's one of the demands. What about your 19,000 centrifuges? Why do you need 19,000 for a civilian nuclear program? What about your buried facility underground in the mountain next to Qom? Why does a civilian program need that? You know, all the hard questions that people want to have answers to, and he responded to them one by one. So I did feel for people who follow this carefully, like me, other journalists, and people around the world who follow foreign policy, there was a basic text to look at and work from as we go forward in these negotiations.
What does Iran want? What does the United States want and the world want? What does Israel want?
Well, what Iran wants, at least in its public formulation, is recognition of what it claims is its right to enrich uranium under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it signed. And it claims that this treaty allows all countries, all signatories, to have civilian nuclear programs, including this asserted right to enrich uranium. The U.S. says there is no such right in the treaty, and if you look carefully, as I have, I think that's probably true. There isn't a specified right to enrichment. It's not prohibited either, so the Iranians can claim that since it's not specifically prohibited, it amounts to a right. In any event, that's their bottom line. The document that was signed in Geneva in November is ambiguous about this. Like many diplomatic documents, it allows the Iranians to say we have a right to enrich, and allows the U.S. to say that no, you don't. That's not in the language. The document speaks of a right to civilian nuclear power.
Sure.
And then goes on to say that that may include limited enrichment, may include. So these are the things that are going to be bargained out over the next 6 months. The Iranians want that right recognized, and they want to be, in effect, a pre-nuclear state with the technology, with the centrifuges, with the ability, if they ever decided to move quickly towards nuclear weapons capability. That's my judgment. The U.S. wants to decisively reverse that program. So it wants them to shut down some of their advanced centrifuges, so they're just out of operation. It wants them to shut the facility that's buried into the mountainside at Fordo, not consistent with a civilian nuclear program, the U.S. says. It wants them to close their heavy water reactor at Arak, which can create plutonium, which can then be converted into nuclear fuel. So that's the list of U.S. demands. The Israeli demands are similar. They're probably more emphatic. But I think the point that the U.S. officials have made to the Iranians is, if you want to be included in the world, if you want an end to these sanctions, if you want to turn the corner away from your isolation back toward the world, you need to show the world convincingly that this is a civilian program, and do a series of things. I just went through them. That will show the world that this can only be a civilian program. And that's the bridge the Iranians are going to have to cross.
Do you think it's going to happen? Do you think it's possible?
President Obama has said it's a 50-50 chance. I must say I was less optimistic after my visit than I had been before that we will be able to achieve this. I think the Iranian people very much want to end their isolation, but the idea that the sanctions that we've got in place are crippling Iran, or we often talk about crippling sanctions, not so. This is not a country that's hobbling on its knees. People need to understand the Iranians are good at suffering. They lived through a 9-year-long war with Iraq, in which 1 million Iranians are said to have died. I mean, that was crippling. They lived through that. They have made plans to continue with sanctions. I was told that their budget for this year assumes that sanctions won't be lifted. So they're going forward, I think, on the assumption that they won't get a deal. And the notion that we can punish them into submission by ever tighter sanctions, I think, is mistaken.
Last question, because we're running out of time. Secretary Kerry has invested so much with Israel and Palestine, trying to broker an accord there, some kind of a movement toward a two-state solution. Optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, the first thing I should say is I really admire Secretary Kerry for making this effort. This is one of the thankless jobs of all time. We've had so many efforts by U.S. diplomats to find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue without success. Right now, you'd have to say that it's not likely that he's going to get a breakthrough. The best he could probably get is agreement on the basic framework. I mean, they talk about a framework agreement, and the framework agreement would enunciate in a clearer form all the elements that everybody knows, including the Israelis and Palestinians, will be part of the deal when they finally have the political will to reach it. But if you ask me, is there the political will now on either side to get there and actually do it, as opposed to laying out the framework, I don't see it.
Wow. New book coming out in late spring?
It'll be out in June, yes. June? It'll be out in time for Father's Day, we like to say.
Title?
It's called The Director.
Of like the CIA director?
Like the director in this case is the director of the CIA, and this director wants very much to find a way to change, modernize the CIA, and he decides to ally with a young man who's especially adept at using computers. And this young man turns out to be somebody who is intent on stealing the secrets of the agency's computer system and sharing them with the world. And if that reminds you a little bit of, it sounds a little bit like Edward Snowden.
Wow.
It's a book that's basically, you know, a post-Snowden novel.
Have you walked right into that perfectly?
Well, we'll see.
David,
thank you very much, Dennis.
Good to be with you
Thanks.
again.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Whether at home or traveling abroad, our goal is to use our weekly programs to learn about other countries and cultures. From the desert of Oman to downtown Singapore, or talking with guests in New York or Washington, we're learning about the world. Join us every week for This is America and the World. For information about my new book, The Chance of a Lifetime, and online video for all This is America programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net. And now you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. This is America is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and the F.Y. Chang Foundation. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing and distribution services.